My name is Centopani. I'm a professional bodybuilder. That means I eat a lot. Luckily, I love to cook as much as I love to eat. For me, it's essential to not only eat in a way that supports my goals, but is as enjoyable and as healthy as possible. Follow along. We'll cook, we'll eat, and who knows what else. This is Evan's World. Done. We're here to talk beef. More specifically, steak. So what about it? Well, we already know that Americans eat a ton of red meat. And at that, bodybuilders especially eat a ton of steak. Usually, not always. Actually, I'm somewhat of an exception. I actually usually don't eat a ton of red meat. But this is the off season. And in the off season, I eat beef fairly regularly, 4 to 5 times a week. Now, contrast that with some other bodybuilders who are eating red meat multiple times daily, and my intake is relatively modest. But for me, I feel that, 4, sometimes 5 times a week, that's quite a bit of beef. So I'm here to talk about, first of all, different cuts of beef. Now, if you go to the grocery store, you've got choices. You might go and see a big piece of meat and say, wow, London broil, that's cheap. That looks very lean. That looks like a good piece of meat. Usually it's going to be like shoe leather. And now my feeling with red meat is that when it comes to digestibility, which is very, very, very important, if you can barely chew through a piece of meat, your body's probably going to have a difficult time digesting it. Right? Think about it. If your teeth can't get through it, it's going to be work for your system to do what it's got to do. So let's talk about the grading system for beef, right? You've all heard of prime beef. What that is basically is it's a measurement of the amount of intramuscular fat that a piece of beef contains. The more intramuscular fat, then hopefully it's finely distributed, called the marbling, the higher the grade of the beef that it is, prime beef. Now, even once you get into prime beef, I'm sure there's all different delineations and grades thereof. But for the purpose of this video, and for what most of us are gonna find at the grocery store and or the butcher shop, we're gonna talk about select, which is kind of the lowest, at least that I know of. And it's probably the lowest grade of beef anybody should buy, is select. Then there's choice, which is pretty decent. If you get a good piece of choice beef, especially if it's Angus, it's going to be all right. And then there's prime, which of course is great, but usually very, very, very expensive. Choice is usually doable in terms of cost, and it's pretty decent tasting and texturally. So choice is usually a safe place for you guys to be. What about grass-fed beef? Well, cows that eat grass are usually very lean, right? Usually grain and corn and things like that are fed to cattle to fatten them up and to increase that amount of intramuscular fat, which makes the meat much more tender and more flavorful. So usually grass-fed beef isn't the most flavorful or tender, although it does usually have a distinct flavor. Maybe it's a little bit more earthy or gamey tasting, and it is good. But usually when it's going to be grass-fed beef, I stick to it being ground, where they work in some extra fat. Because I have to be honest with you, very lean cuts of beef, with the exception of like a tenderloin, for filet mignon, usually the leaner it is, the tougher it's going to be. And the tougher it is, usually the harder it is to digest, and I'm not into that. I like stuff that digests well. And I found that I usually digest a more tender, fattier cut of beef than I do a very lean, tough piece of meat. This leads us to the question, why all the fuss about red meat anyways? And it's long been held that red meat is in some way anabolic. That it's the most ideal food for bodybuilders. I don't know if that's exactly the case, that it's the best food, but I do think that it has a value. A lot of it is that it contains quite a bit of saturated fat, and for someone in an off season looking to gain size and strength, that's a good thing. You don't want to shy away from the fat and the saturated fat, because although people tend to associate carbohydrates with muscle fullness, keep in mind that your body also stores fats intramuscularly as well. And that if you're fat depleted, you will not be nice and full and round and a good pump. Red meat, yeah, good choice. I tend to notice that if I am eating red meat a little bit more consistently, that I'm a bit stronger, a bit fuller. But it's not the holy grail. But I do think that if you're in an off season, red meat is something worth having in your diet. And I would rather see you invest in a decent piece of meat rather than have beef multiple times a day and have it be, you know, cheap and hard to digest and all that. What we're here to do is to cook the perfect steak. I think you need 3 ingredients: some olive oil, some salt, and the meat. That's it. Piece of beef, you don't need to go marinating it and putting all sorts of seasonings and shit on it. You know, you're just gonna, I guess if you have a crappy piece of meat, you're gonna wanna do that to cover up the taste of it. But if you've got a good piece of meat, some salt, a little bit of oil on the grill, cooked the right way, which I'm gonna show you, you'll be good to go. Let's get to that. All I'm gonna do, oh, and by the way, this is a ribeye. For anybody interested, it is a fattier cut of beef. You could see, besides what's around the outside, there's a good bit of, you know, marbling in it. If you look at the outside of it and you notice this meat running along the outside, same thing over here, super, super marbled, very, very tender. That's the best part of the steak. I will also eat porterhouses, which is on one side a New York strip, and the other side filet mignon. Really, those are the only 2 in my mind worth having, a porterhouse or a ribeye. So a little bit of oil on it, just to coat it. Some coarse sea salt. Now don't be afraid, put quite a bit. Now this is a thick piece of meat here, right? So don't be afraid to put enough salt on it. So just put it on right before you're ready to cook it. One thing I would recommend though, is letting the meat come to room temperature. Why? You're gonna get a better, it's gonna cook better, and eventually, or inevitably, you're gonna get better texture out of it. So don't be afraid to leave the meat out for an hour or so. You're not gonna grow all this bacteria and die. Besides, keep in mind with red meat, the only bacteria you have to worry about is what's on the outside of the meat, which we're gonna go kill right now. We've got the steak ready to go. Got the salt and oil on it. We're just gonna bring it outside and throw it on the grill. Let's go. Regarding temperature, right? Not every grill has a thermometer built into it. Luckily this one does. And I've used the grill enough to know, kind of what's optimal. This grill has 3 zones on it. So what I usually do is I crank one zone up all the way to get the temperature inside the grill to get it up, which right now it's between 400 or 500 degrees. The part of the grill that I'm gonna cook on isn't turned up as high. Reason is there's quite a bit of fat on this steak, and if it's turned up too high, as the fat begins to melt and drip down, it's gonna flare up and the steak's gonna be caught in a fire, and that we don't want. Not only does it ruin the taste of the steak, but it's actually very, very, very unhealthy. So I've got this one part of the grill where the temperature is down, and that's the part I'm gonna begin on. Look at that. When you're cooking a steak, it's important that you keep a good close eye on it, make sure it's not flaring up and burning, but also don't fuck with it, right? So long as it looks good, yep, that's good. Close the lid and leave it alone. See how this is doing. Oh yeah, see? Once we start to get some good grill marks on it, right? I'm gonna turn it once, 90 degrees. You're bringing the meat into different parts of contact with different parts of the grate. So I think it does help to cook it a little bit more evenly, just to give it a rotate. It's not just to make it look pretty, just 90%. You can see the meat is cooking because even though we haven't flipped it yet, this side is starting to change color. It's not so much red anymore. It's starting to cook around the outside, and let's see how it's looking. One more minute, we're gonna give it a flip. Should be about ready to be flipped. Oh yeah, perfect. Same thing, flip it, leave it alone. It's not gonna have to cook for as long on this side as it did on the first side. And now that it's ready for the turn, what I'm gonna do is move it to a part of the grill that's a little bit hotter, but I'm gonna shut this part of the grill off. But now this part of the grill and this part of the grill are still on, which basically I'm using the grill as an oven. All right, at this point, steak should be done. And I'm gonna tell you how I know when to pull it off. Yep, it starts to get like a film, like juices start to come up out of it once it's been on there long enough, and that's when I pull it off. And I'm gonna bring it inside to rest. We're gonna eat some steak. Now that the steak is cooked and it's had a chance to rest, now why do you let a steak rest? If you were to pull it right off the grill and it's hot, you bring it inside, all the juice is just gonna spill right out of the steak. The texture is not gonna be as good and the flavor won't be as good. So if you leave it and let it come down, obviously not back down to room temperature, that'd be too cold, but I let it sit for about 10 minutes and it's still gonna be plenty warm. The texture is gonna be much, much, much better. You have a steak, right? You never cut it this way. You're always gonna cut it this way. So let's just cut into it, see how it looks. I like my steak about medium rare. Sometimes medium rare, it could actually be a little bit tougher. Sometimes as you cook a steak, the texture improves and then you reach a point where the texture is fucked. So don't overcook it. But that's about perfect. And I will eat this fat and everything because that's just how I do it. Hope you liked the vid. I hope you put some of this to use. Stop cooking shitty steaks and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Come back here for more vids. Check out Centopani.com. I'll see you guys soon. Take a hike. I'm gonna eat this steak.